1 Samuel 30 is where we are. And one of my favorite chapters is this chapter because I remember reading this chapter as a teenager and as a kid. And it always spoke to me about David's resilience and how strong he was through the chapter. But just to recap, in 1 Samuel 29, David, he's in battle formation with the Philistines, with Achish at the rear, with the king. And the Philistines notice that David is there and that David's out of place. And they're reminded of David's victory over Goliath. They're reminded about all the victory songs about David. And they're furious because they're wondering, why is the enemy of the Philistines marching with us in battle? And they demand that he's sent home, and they insist on King Achish sending him back home. David has been there for 16 months, and now rejected by the Philistine army. He's walking home, and in verse 1, it says this: "Now it happened, when David and his men came to Ziklag on the third day, that the Amalekites had invaded the south in Ziklag, attacked Ziklag and burned it with fire, and had taken captive the women and those who were from there, from small to great. They did not kill anyone, but carried them away and went their way." So he goes back from Aphek to Ziklag. This is 3 days or a 75-mile journey. Now, when the Philistine army and the Israelites are at Jezreel, I don't know if I have the map here. I forgot to put the map in. But the idea is they're marching all the way down south, back home. And what happens is the Amalekites, they take this opportunity to attack David's family, the city where all the men are staying at. In verse 3, "So David and his men came to the city, and there it was, burned with fire, and their wives, their sons, and their daughters had been taken captive. Then David and the people who were with him lifted up their voices and wept until they had no more power to weep." So after 3 days, they're expecting rest, they're expecting comfort, they're expecting to sleep and eat and nourish themselves. But they come back and they see smoke rising. It says the city here, it's burned with fire. Their kids are taken, their families are all taken. Imagine driving home and seeing an ambulance at your house as you turn the corner. Imagine seeing a police officer in front of your house. I remember this happened to me one time, and I saw an ambulance and a police car in front of my house coming home. Luckily it wasn't my house, it was my neighbor's house. I say that in a horrible way, right? And it was nothing serious. But imagine seeing that in front of your house and seeing smoke arise from your house or seeing a fire. This is what David and his men are seeing now. They're seeing Ziklag burned with fire, the family's taken away. The irony here is this: Ziklag was supposed to be a fortified city. It was supposed to be a walled city. It was supposed to be safe by all natural means. But David's choice to live there, it was driven more by discouragement than by God's will. If you remember how all this happened, he was discouraged and he said in his heart that he's going to die. And he ended up living in Ziklag out of God's will. And for you and I, when we attempt to do anything or build something, whether it's start a job or move to a new place, if it's apart from God's will, it's in vain. And there's no peace in any of that. It's so easy to be impulsive about something, and to not pray about something or not seek godly counsel, and to jump into something. And we end up thinking that we're making a good decision, but in reality, it's not a good decision. And this is what happens to David here. And notice their response here. They lifted up their voices and they wept. And they wept so much that they had no more power to weep. And I remember this happened to me at my mom's when she was in the hospital. After 3 days, I couldn't even cry anymore. I just gave up. You know what? I'm not even going to cry. It's literally physically too hard to cry. I don't know if you've ever been in that position where you've cried so much that it absolutely depletes the energy in your body. But that's what's happening here. And this whole mess, it begins in 1 Samuel 27:1. Begins when, in his heart, where he doesn't inquire of the Lord, he listens to his own heart. And the phrase it says in 1 Samuel 27:1 is, Then David said to himself. And he says these things to himself, and he ends up in this place. In verse 5, "And David's 2 wives, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and Abigail the widow of Nabal the Carmelite, had been taken captive." So these are his 2 wives. "Now David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because the soul of all the people was grieved. every man for his sons and his daughters. But, and notice this phrase, David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. Now imagine your whole family being taken from you in an instant. Imagine your kids being taken from you. Everyone here is trying to kill him. They spoke of stoning him. Their heart is grieved. In this moment, his life comes crashing down. And God allows this to happen because his alliance with the Philistines is rejected. His family is carried away. His friends' loyalty is taken away from him. His own men are considering killing him. It reminds me of the story of the prodigal son. And in the story of the prodigal son, if you remember the prodigal son, he squanders all of his father's wealth. He finds himself with the pigs, and then suddenly he has his aha moment. David right now, after his life comes crashing down, that's when he begins to seek the Lord. That's when he strengthens himself in the Lord. You know, C.S. Lewis said this, God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks to us in our conscience, but shouts in our pain. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. I don't know if you've ever had situations where your life just comes crashing down, but God loves us too much to allow you and I to backslide. This can happen to me at work. Sometimes I've learned not to do this, but I'll start work sometimes just with a quick prayer, not really praying as much as I want to. God allows my workday to come crashing down, right? He allows everything to go wrong. Everything just is bad. And by noon, I'm like, this day is so weird. Everything is just horrible, right? And I realize in those moments, right, that I didn't spend time with God, and I didn't seek him as much as I wanted to. But even in this tragedy, though God's discipline was painful, it's also tender because look at the silver lining. His wives aren't killed. His kids aren't killed, right? They're actually preserved. In fact, they're more merciful. The Amalekites are more merciful than David because when David went on his raids, he killed everyone. The Amalekites kept them alive in God's mercy. But David's reaction here is this. He strengthens himself in the Lord. Right? He goes back to God. He returns back to him wholeheartedly. Compare this to Saul. And I think of this analogy. In high school, I read a book called A Tale of Two Cities. I don't know if anyone still reads that anymore, but this is a tale of two kings. When Saul is threatened by the stronger Philistine army, he goes to a witch. When David is threatened and his life comes crashing down, he returns back to God. Right? He strengthens himself in the Lord. And there's a lesson to be learned there. Right? He did so many things wrong, but when he needed God, he turned back to him. Saul slowly inching away, David slowly inching closer to God. But notice this, God doesn't reject David when he returns to him. For you and I, when people reject us, you don't want to pick up their phone call, you don't want to talk to them, maybe they get one less invitation to something. God doesn't reject David, right? He accepts him, he loves him, he allows him to return back to him. And it reminds me of this in Jeremiah 3:12. When God is speaking to Israel about their backsliding, he says this. He says, go and proclaim these words toward the north and say, return, backsliding Israel, says the Lord. I will not cause my anger to fall on you. I am merciful, says the Lord. I will not remain angry forever. In all of this, God will be merciful to David. Because here's what David will do in verse 7. Then David said to Abiathar the priest, Ahimelech's son, please bring the ephod here to me. And Abiathar brought the ephod to David. So David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I pursue this troop? Shall I overtake them? And he answered him, pursue, for you shall surely overtake them, and without fail recover all. After David strengthens himself in the Lord, notice what he does here. He uses the strength that God gives him to actually seek the Lord. And here's what he's doing. He's going back to inquire of the priests. Now this ephod was a sleeveless garment of the high priest. Attached to the ephod was a breastplate. Inside that were these two stones called the Urim and Thummim. And they were essentially used by the high priest to seek the will of God. Some people think they meant lights and shining, that perhaps somehow light shone through them. We don't know exactly how it worked. But David here, he's going back to seek God. Now this is the first time we're going to see him seeking God from 1 Samuel 23. Back then, he saved the city of Keilah. Between 1 Samuel 23 and 1 Samuel 30, we don't really see David, believe it or not, seeking God. He finally seeks God, and he asks this question: shall I pursue this truth? Shall I overtake them? Before, when David went on raids, he didn't ask God. He just went. He went without God's permission. He went out of God's will. Finally, David is finding the roadmap again. Finally, he's coming back to his sensibilities of seeking God. Even in his depression, even in his brokenness, now that his confidence is gone, he's fully submitted himself to God. And verse 9 says this: so David went, he and the 600 men who were with him, and came to the brook Besor, where those who stayed were left behind. But David pursued, he and 400 men, for 200 men stayed behind, who were so weary that they could not cross the brook Besor. Now this grammar indicates that David heard from God, and that he purposed in his heart to go, and that he would have gone himself, even if the other men didn't go. Right? It says in verse 9, David went, right? And notice this and what's happening here. There are 400 that are going to go attack. There are 200 that are staying behind because they're so tired and weary. Right? They had no strength. Right? They had wept until they could weep no more. They're tired. They're exhausted. So the army is split. David takes 400. 200 are left behind. In verse 11, then they found an Egyptian in the field and brought him to David, and they gave him bread and he ate, and they let him drink water. And they gave him a piece of a cake of figs and 2 clusters of raisins. So when he had eaten, his strength came back for him, for he had eaten no bread nor drunk water for 3 days and 3 nights. So David's men, they find this Egyptian servant who was sick, who was fainted in the field. He had collapsed from starvation and sickness. They gave him food. Then David said to him, to whom do you belong, and where are you from? And he said, I am a young man from Egypt, servant of an Amalekite, and my master left me behind, because 3 days ago I fell sick. We made an invasion, verse 14, we made an invasion of the southern area of the Cherethites, in the territory which belongs to Judah, and to the southern area of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag with fire. So they happen to find this Egyptian in the field. He is famished, he's exhausted, they give him food, and he provides David with valuable information. He's going to tell him exactly where to go. He's going to tell them where the Amalekite army attacked. He's going to tell them where they departed to. Now, all this seems ordinary and mundane, but think about this. And this happens in my life all the time. Even in seemingly mundane or ordinary circumstances, God is often working behind the scenes. He's often helping us, even in moments that we don't realize it. And I think about weeks that I'm tired and I'm exhausted. It's amazing how sometimes work is just a little easier that week, right? I almost think God sees the future ahead of time, and He somehow sees the little things we're doing, and He makes things a little more easier, right? Just because He knows how much we can handle. I think when I went to the airport last week, we went to Texas. We had like 3 big suitcases. I still don't know why we packed so much for like small trips. 3 big suitcases and a carry-on, my dad had a suitcase. We needed a luggage cart. There were no luggage carts in the airport. I found one in the corner, like behind the ticketing counter, right? One tiny one out of a huge airport. But those little things, right? I don't know how we would have got the luggage inside. It's a big ordeal with kids. You guys know that. But those little things, how God is working behind the scenes in ordinary circumstances, these are not coincidences. And this Egyptian in the field is not a coincidence. Right? God has left him there for David. And David said to him, can you take me down to the truth? So he said, swear to me by God that you will neither kill me nor deliver me into the hands of my master, and I will take you down to this truth. So the Egyptian man tells David, hey, I'll show you where they went. I'll tell you where the Amalekites went. But here's what I want you to do, David. Don't kill me. Keep me alive. And he exchanges information for protection. In verse 16, and when he had brought him down, there they were, spread out over all the land, eating and drinking and dancing. So they're celebrating here because they had just attacked Ziklag and taken the things of David and his men. Eating and drinking and dancing because of all the great spoil which they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from the land of Judah. So the Egyptian man, he leads David to the right place, They're having this huge party here, right? They're eating, they're drinking, they're dancing, right? They're completely celebrating. And they had great spoil here. If you remember when David had married Abigail, right? Nabal, which is Abigail's husband, was very rich. I think he had 3,000 sheep and 300 goats. I believe 30 sheep and 30 goats was considered a great measure of wealth. So Nabal was essentially 1,000 times richer than the average Israelite. So David had married Abigail after Nabal died. So there's a lot of treasure here they've received. They're celebrating. They're excited. They've hit the jackpot. Then David attacked from twilight until the evening of the next day. This is a 24-hour attack because they're going from twilight until evening of the next day. Think like 5 p.m. to 5 p.m. 24 hours. It's a surprise attack. Everyone's drunk. They're intoxicated. Now they're being attacked by David and his men. And not a man of them escaped, except 400 young men who rode on camels and fled. A mini lesson here that I always remind myself. David trusted God, but he also had to work hard in battle. This is a 24-hour battle. Although David prays and seeks God, and God gives him an answer and tells him to attack, and he finds this Egyptian man, David still has to be on his feet 24 hours, no sleep. Some days I have to work 12 hours, some days long weekends, some days it's 4 hours, right? But it's easy to get bitter at God when you have a lot of work, right? It's easy to get angry at God. David trusted God, but for you and I, we also had to work hard if we put our mind to do something, whether it's, fixing the garage or work or planning a Thanksgiving dinner. There's hard work to be done. In verse 18, so David recovered all the Amalekites had carried away. Notice the phrase all. And David rescued his 2 wives. And nothing of theirs was lacking, either small or great, sons or daughters, spoil or anything which they had taken from them. David recovered all. Then David took all the flocks and herds which they had driven before those other livestock and said, "This is David's spoil." The amazing thing is this. The city's attacked. Ziklag was burned. He recovers everything. God in his grace allows David to recover every single thing that he lost. And here's the sequence of events here. David strengthens himself in the Lord. He inquires of the Lord. He obeys the Lord. He labors in the Lord. God, in his richness and mercy, allows him to recover all. I'm reminded of this, though there are consequences of sin. Sometimes God can restore what the enemy steals. This doesn't happen all the time. If you get drunk and you crash into a car and you break your back, you might feel the pain of that for the rest of your life. But God can still restore even the most direst, darkest sin that we commit. And here, as David is in Ziklag, 16 months, apart from the will of God, living there, and as his town is attacked, God gives him grace to recover everything. And think of Joel, verse 2, verse 25 and 6. God says this through the prophet Joel to the nation of Israel. He says this, "So I will restore to you the years that the swarming locust has eaten, the crawling locust, the consuming locust, and the chewing locust, my great army which I sent among you. You shall eat in plenty and be satisfied, and praise the name of the Lord your God, who has dealt wondrously with you. And my people shall never be put to shame." God had told Israel, right, if you return to me, right, I'll restore to you the years that the locust has eaten. And that's a message so many of us need to hear. You may have lived a season of your life in sin. You may have lived a decade or 2 decades or 3 decades. Even through that, God can redeem still, right, even at an older age. And so many people think, I did so many dumb things and I messed up and now I just lost my opportunity. You did, in one sense, but God is so gracious. He's so merciful to allow opportunities to come back to us. Now, I think I shared this story before, but I was asked to work at a church when I was working as a teacher. And I turned it down really quickly, the first time. And I didn't pray about it. I didn't really think through it. Looking back, I should have taken that opportunity. God in his mercy allowed that opportunity to come back to me about 4 or 5 years later, right, through another situation. But it's amazing how God can take sometimes an impulsive decision, a season of life where we're not praying as much or just wandering away, and he can still redeem missed opportunities. Another lesson here is this. The Amalekites are also a picture and type of the flesh. In 1 Samuel 15, God had told Saul to destroy the Amalekites. Saul doesn't do that because Saul wanted to keep the plunder. Samuel finishes that job, and as a result of Saul's inaction, the Amalekites will continue to plague Israel. Right? They're going to come back here. In Scripture, there's a type of the flesh, right? Because you see in 1 Samuel 2:11, Peter says this, "Beloved, I beg you as sojourners and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts." Notice that word, which war against the soul. Every battle that the nation of Israel fought, there's a picture of the type of the flesh. It's not that we are supposed to go out and fight with fists and weapons, but it's a picture that you and I have a battle every day, against our flesh, to fight it, to quench it, to make sure that whatever we've struggled with in our flesh doesn't come back and overtake us. It's the reason why I don't keep alcohol in my house. As a Christian, there's nothing wrong with having alcohol in your house. There's nothing wrong with having a drink here and there. The Bible doesn't prohibit that. We didn't talk about this, right? We talked about not fulfilling the lust of the flesh, or not giving an opportunity for the flesh to arise. We talked about not making alcohol a stumbling block. But I don't keep it in my house for another reason. Number one, I don't trust me. I don't trust my flesh. Right? I don't trust how much wine I'll drink. Right? I don't trust myself for that reason. But we're called to war against the flesh. We're called to be aware of that and to fight this battle every single day. And alcohol is just 1/10 of that. Right? There's other things that our flesh always is trying to invoke in us. It could be bitterness. It could be unforgiveness. It could be, pornography. It could be sexual temptation. There's a constant war against our flesh that we're fighting every single day. And David came, verse 21, to the 200 men who had been so weary that they could not follow David, whom they had also made to stay at the brook Besor. So they went out to meet David and to meet the people who were with him. And when David came near the people, he greeted them. So think about what's happening here. 400 men had gone to fight. 200 men are just resting because they couldn't fight. So these 400 tired, exhausted men, blood all over themselves, probably exhausted, having done fighting, bruised, beat up. You got these other 200 that are like lounging back by the river, right? Drinking water and eating grapes. So imagine what's about to happen here. Verse 22, then all the wicked and worthless men, those who went with David, answered and said, because they did not go with us, we will not give them any of the spoil that we have recovered, except for the man's wife and children, that they may lead them away and depart. Here's a conflict here David's facing. The ones who fought aren't happy with the guys who stayed back. Right? They don't want to give back what they recovered. One of the guys who's maybe resting is seeing his camel. He's saying, hey, that's my camel. The other guy's saying, no, well, it's my camel now because I went and fought this battle. Right? So there's a conflict here, and David has this leadership challenge where he has to face. The guys who fought, the guys who didn't do nothing, were rested, and they're fighting now. And they're about to argue here. But David said in verse 23, my brethren, you shall not do so what the Lord has given us, who has preserved us, and delivered into our hand the troop that came against us. Notice who David gives glory to here. For who you heed in this matter, but as is his part who goes down to the battle, so shall be his part who stays by the supplies. They shall share alike. So it was from that day forward, he made a statute and an ordinance for Israel to this day. So David tells the men, he tells the guys, listen, you guys are muscular. I know you guys lift weights at the gym and you're really strong and you fought this battle and you're on your feet 24 hours. But David says, it's not you that fought this battle. It's God who fought this battle. This happens in my life, and I think this sometimes. When we think we've worked hard for something and labored with all our strength, remember this. It's the Lord that gives us wisdom and strength. It's God that preserves us. It's God that delivers the results. David understands that fact. Do we thank God enough for the wisdom he gives us during the day? Do we thank God enough for the energy he gives us during the day? Do we thank God enough for the little decisions, the little results he gives us during the day? It's easy to take credit. It's easy to say, I spent 2 hours reading this book, 2 hours studying, or 2 hours cleaning, or 2 hours fixing this. I did a great job. Really, it's God that made those muscles work. It's God that made that brain function. Paul said this in 1 Corinthians 4:7. For who makes you different from another? And what do you have that you did not receive? Now, if you did indeed receive it, why do you boast as if you had not received it? Paul is saying essentially, don't brag about your strength. Don't brag because maybe you have more wisdom, or you have more better ideas, or you have a better degree. He's saying, what do you have that you did not receive? Another lesson in all this is this. You have a bunch of guys that are staying back, maybe not doing work that's as visible, and you have some guys that are fighting on the front lines. In the church, some people serve God in visible, noticeable roles. Like I'm up here, I'm teaching, people see my video. But there are other people that serve behind the scenes. And from God's perspective, all those who labor, whether up front or hidden, they will share in heavenly rewards. It's easy to downplay the work of the people that stay with the stuff. It can look easier, right? It can look relaxing. But sometimes it's just as hard, right? Sometimes there's less credit that goes to the person who does the paperwork, or the person who's praying in secret, or the person that's setting up the chairs. Or sometimes we think, oh, well, the person who gave the message, the person who sang the song, they're going to be rewarded greatly. I don't think I'll be rewarded greatly in heaven, because there are people that serve God so diligently without ever being up in front of people, right? Those are the people that God sees. Those are the people that he doesn't miss, right? Those people will be blessed as much as well. I remember when I went to a small church in Florida, it was a Calvary Chapel. I remember there was a guy who would get up Saturdays at 6 a.m. to clean the church. And I'd go with him once in a while. He cleaned the church better than I've seen anyone clean their own house. He was an ex-Navy, ex-Marine, 65-year-old guy, really tough. The best cleaning products. He would get there exactly at 5:45 to open up the church, just so that people could come and clean. He cleaned everything meticulously, and he told us to clean it meticulously as well. Not a single spot on the counter was missed. He had the right cleaning ingredients for every type of counter. Everything was mopped. The shades were dusted. Everything was vacuumed. Chairs were taken apart. The way I learned to clean watching this man, right? 6 a.m. Saturday morning. He'd have 2 or 3 guys that would just come and clean. There was another gentleman at the church. He was another veteran. He was an usher. But the way he ushered was the most studious, diligent, impressive ushering I've ever seen in my life. He'd first get to the church every Sunday. Church started like at 9:30. He'd get there by 8:30. Every single chair was meticulously in a row, to the centimeter. If you moved the chair by an inch, he knew. To the centimeter in a row. Everything was ready for the ushers. Everything was printed. If there was communion, everything was delivered perfectly, timed, ordered. When people walked into the church, he ushered them. He greeted them. He smiled. He shook their hand. He walked them to their seat. It was the best experience you could have walking to a church. It was so friendly. It was so kind. Everything was meticulously done in order. But that's another guy who won't be known next to Billy Graham or Chuck Swindoll. But he's a man that God sees. God sees his heart. And sometimes we don't notice the people that are doing the little things like that. And it's amazing, right, how sometimes people behind the scenes are neglected, right, by other people. But another point in this chapter, notice this really quickly. As David follows God in all of this, he regains the trust of his men. He's had a situation where everyone wanted to kill him. Everyone was distressed. They lost their family. They wanted to get rid of David. In a complete 180, he's sought God. He's inquired of God. He's worked hard. He's delivered results, and they've received their things back. He finally regains the trust of his men. It's hard leading people because people can easily discredit you. People could not trust your decisions. People cannot trust your leadership. But as you follow God, as you display godliness and integrity, and as you walk with Him, it's amazing how God will, bless your leadership and watch over how you lead people. And David here, he's going to once again reemerge from the ashes. The men are going to start following him again. In verse 26 to 31, as we wrap up here. Now when David came to Ziklag, he sent some of the spoil to the elders of Judah, to his friends, saying, "Here's a present for you from the spoil of the enemies from the Lord. To those who are in Bethel, those who are in Ramoth of the south, those who are in Jatir, Aroer, Siphmoth, Esthmiah," I'm just going through these names quickly, Rakal, the Jerahmeelites, those who are in the cities of the Kenites, Hormah, Shorish, and Attak, those who are in Hebron, and to all the places where David himself and his men were accustomed to rove. So David sent spoil to the 13 cities of Judah. He's come to his senses now. After 16 months of being in hiatus, he's now trying to repair the relationships he's neglected. He kind of reemerges back on the scene. It's kind of like a friend who shows up after like 10 years. They call you out of nowhere and they reemerge. David himself, as he's returning back to God, he's trying to repair his relationships because his vision is restored. He's reminded of what his purpose is to be. He's reminded that he is called to be the king of Israel. And he's once again, in a small way, he's reaching out to the elders of Judah to rebuild these relationships. Now, some final thoughts as we conclude here. Number one, all of us will have a Ziklag season. This is a place or a season that you and I run to in our discouragement that's not in God's will. Like David, it's so easy to talk ourselves into discouragement. It's easy to talk ourselves into thinking that we're supposed to be in a place that God doesn't want us to be in. Or we're supposed to be in a place and we think it's right, even though God doesn't want us to be there. All of us have that season where it's just Ziklag. Right? We're not sure why we're there, but it just feels like it's okay. And that often happens because we're so discouraged and broken, and we end up there. Number two, God loves us enough to let us wander too far. When life comes crashing down, God may be trying to get our attention. Think of what happened in David's life here. I believe God was trying to speak to David in many ways. It wasn't until his life came crashing down, until everything was taken from him, that God got his attention. And he responded appropriately. Number three, the Amalekites are a type of the flesh. Just as the Israelites fought the Amalekites, or David fought the Amalekites, they were in constant battles throughout the Old Testament. All of us have a battle against the flesh every single day to fight. We have a battle to fight against bitterness and unforgiveness, and against lust, and against indulgence, and whatever else sin may find in our lives. It's not that you fight it once and it's done. I wish it was like that. Right? It's not like a TKO where you knock it out and it's gone for the rest of your life. Sin in our flesh often reemerges. Right? It comes back in different ways, in different seasons in our life. Finally, number four, not finally, but next to last. The effects of sin may last a lifetime, but God can still redeem and restore. God can still redeem and restore through the effects of sin. And number five, in many ways, you look at David's life, he's a type of Christ in this chapter. To the Egyptian slave, he's a source of refreshment and strength. That guy would have died in the field. He's a source of refreshment and strength who keeps his promises. To the elders of Judah, he's a source of unmerited grace. To his weary men, he's a compassionate and wise leader who reconciles them with their families and restores what they have lost. Jesus will refer himself to the Son of David, and in so many ways you see the sanctification of David. You see how God is conforming him to the image of Christ as these chapters progress, even through his faults and failures. Right? We see glimpses of Christ. We see glimpses of light and who God is in David's life. And so he's a fascinating character to study. I love the stories of David. I love reading about him. This is one of my favorite chapters. I encourage you guys to read it again if you want. I love the resilience and perseverance and just what he does and how he picks himself up and strengthens himself in the Lord. that's about all I have to say